Hi and welcome to Ask GMBN Tech. This is the Q&A session. You ask the questions and we hopefully help you out in how to fix or tune your bicycles. Get your questions in the comments underneath. Don't forget to use the hashtag Ask GMBN Tech so we know which ones are questions and which ones are comments. This week is a bit of a suspension clinic. I think we've done a few videos on suspension recently and asked if there was anything you want to know. So we've got a bunch of questions here. First question this week is about coil sizes. So the actual size physically of the spring. It says, how do you know which coil size you need? Okay, so when you look at the actual coil spring itself, you'll see some numbers on there. The first number, the bigger number, let's say it's 450, will mean that it's a 450 pound spring. And what that refers to is it will take 450 pounds of weight to compress the spring an inch, basically. So that is the spring weight. And you get these typically in 50 pound increments, although some brands of spring, you can get them in 25 pound increments, so you can sort of fine tune the right one for you. The second measurement on there, you might see it as a 450X and then like a 2.25 or something like that. The 2.25 or whatever that secondary number is refers to how much that spring can be compressed, because you get a thing called coil bound where the spring cannot physically compress anymore. And if that happens before the length of the shock stroke happens, i.e. the stroke on here, then you might not achieve full travel. So it's really important to get one that correlates to your shock. And the third thing you need to take into account is the physical length of the coil spring. Now, some coil springs will suit massive downhill shocks, others will suit shorter shocks. You need to know the distance between the spring retaining clip that sits here on the shock and with the preload clip when it's fully unwound. So that distance will be the maximum size spring that you can get in there. But typically these will kind of correlate to that secondary number, which will be like the 2.25, and that will be figured out around the stroke of the actual shock as well, which is that movement there. Hopefully that answers that question. There is a bit more information online about it, but that pretty much clears that one up. Next up says, is it normal to lose PSI, says pounds per square inch, in your rear shock after a hard ride? Losing 10 to 20 PSI in my float CTD, thank you. No, I don't think that is normal. Now you can get differences in damping consistencies, be that from weather conditions where things can get a bit slower, or perhaps the opposite, like when you're riding a really long, rough trail, the viscosity of the oil on the inside can get thinner. So therefore your damping gets a bit quicker or a little less damping. But I've not heard of, a very specific amount of air leaking from your shock. So you could have a leaky valve, it could be an old perished seal that's just leaking out. Sounds like you might want to get on the phone to your nearest suspension tuner or a bike shop that can offer that service for you and ask them if they've had any particular problems with a Fox Float CTD. And it sounds like you might be looking for a service and possibly some new seals on there. Good luck, hope that works. Next one, is hard suspension fast? Is this a trick question? Do you mean by setting a suspension up to feel firm? Is that what you mean, like physically hard suspension? In which case, yes and no. So, how can I put this? I'll use downhill bike races as an example here, and we'll talk about Aaron Gwin. So Aaron Gwin has famously had what many people have observed as a very firm suspension system on his bike. But when he rides a bike, he's using auto travel all the time. So why is that? So just think about what's going on here. So Aaron Gwin, I don't know his height, I don't know his weight, but if his suspension is set up as firm as some people say, it's all relative to the speed that he rides the bike at. So if you get on his bike in a car park, yeah, it may well feel very firm. But if you ride the bike, well, it's not going to happen. No one's going to be able to ride the bike as fast as he can. But if you were to ride a bike as fast as he can into rocks, roots, drops and stuff, suddenly that suspension is going to come to life and work correctly. So it's all relative to the way the bike is being ridden. So to a degree, fast suspension is hard suspension, but it's only about the speed at which you ride the bike, which is why a lot of us, myself included, will have suspension a lot softer because you ride it a bit slower. And it's got to deal with comfort as well as absorbing the shock. At the speeds racers like Aaron Gwin race and ride at, they're not looking for comfort. They're looking for maximum control, in which case the suspension has to be set up appropriately. So another thing to observe is a very fast bike, i.e. a race bike that's set up to go very fast in race conditions, will normally feel pretty ropey in a car park. You wouldn't expect them to feel very nice because of the fact they're ridden at such high intensity, and then the bike will come to life and it will actually feel soft like yours or mine will in normal conditions, if that makes sense. Next up, which one do you ride the most, coil or air? Air, hands down. Air shocks are amazing. I'm a huge fan of them. That's not to say that I don't love coil shocks, because I do. I think they're incredible, and I've still got one. I still chop and change. So when I used to ride a lot more downhill bikes, I was always a coil shock fan because that's what there was. Air shocks were creeping in on sort of cross-country bikes, but the problem with air shocks initially in mountain bikes is they weren't very sensitive. They didn't have negative air springs in there. Some of them had a coil spring as a negative, but really they had a thing that we call stiction. So you've got to overcome the static friction of the shock, and you're overcoming the air spring and the seals for it to work. They just weren't very active. So coil shock was always a better approach. But as technology changed, I think the first, I'm going to say DHX Air. It was a downhill shock anyway by Fox, and they did a coil version and an air version. And I think that was the first one that opened my eyes to what air shock capabilities could do. Now, it was flawed. It had issues with inconsistencies with rebound damping on there, which I remember specifically riding a Marin, one of the Quake XLT style bikes, and the damping had gone completely, and I hit a jump and nearly went out the front door, and it was scarier than not crashing because you so nearly crashed, if that makes sense. But it was a real good look to the future. You could adjust the boost on there, you could adjust a lot of things on there, and in fact there should be a shot on screen of my old Ozonic full suspension bike that had that shock on it. Of course, I rode loads of other shocks back to back over the years, but as air shocks started really improving, I've been a huge fan. And it's taken a long time for them to get as good as even basic can shocks like this are now. But the air shock, I think, is largely king. It's not to suggest that a coil shock can't do a better job. I mean, for the fact that you have more, the designers have more freedom in the way that they can spec and design a bike to handling attributes, the way the suspension works, what they can do with the shock. And as a consumer, it's a really good thing for you because you can get a bike off the shop floor, set it up the way you want to go and ride it straight away. Coil shocks, it's never quite that simple because you've got to fine tune the coil spring on there, and always, you know, as with the differences between the two shocks, as you might know from the video I made, if you haven't watched it, it's down there, is the fact that a coil shock is linear and an air shock is progressive, and there's just more that you can do with it. Of course, they both have their positives and their negatives, but I'm an air fan. I like the air shock, and nice and light as well. And they're also very practical as well, if you want to be a bit more like that, because the fact a bike manufacturer can spec an air shock and that's it. It can go in the shop and it will suit the person that rides it. Whereas a coil shock, they're going to have to ship it with a couple of springs, or the bike shop's going to have to take care of that. So there's more admin on that front. So yeah. Next, in fact, two questions here, both asking similar things. One says, can I use different shock length if the frame allows it to increase or decrease travel? And the other one says, can I put a new shock on a bike that has a longer stroke than the stock one? So, yes and no. So technically, yes, you could, but you need to make sure that things don't happen. So if you're going for a longer travel, well, in fact, or a shorter travel, whichever way, you could have the tyre contacting the frame, you can have the linkage hitting the frame. There's a number of things. You've got to bear in mind that when suspension designers are designing frames, they are designed around a very specific length shock with a very specific shock stroke. We're talking in millimetres here. So if you go over or under that, there's a good chance that something on your frame will foul. So if it doesn't, then technically, yeah, you could do that, but also it's going to ruin your geometry as well. So personally, I'd just steer clear of that and run the correct length shock with the correct shock stroke for your bike. But it has been known to be able to eke a little bit more performance out of a bike on rare occasions. I can't give you an example off the top of my head. Perhaps there's someone watching that's done that. If you have, let us know down there. Keen to know what you've done, if you've increased or decreased your travel, and what shock and what bike it's on. It's all good information to have. Next up, how do you measure rear shock travel? Well, there's a few ways. You can, with an air shock, you can literally, this one hasn't got an O-ring, but you can measure using the O-ring. Basically, when you set your sag for the 30% sag, you'll know how much stroke the shock has. You can physically measure it here. Or if it's a coil shock and you can't actually do that, you can go the old school method. So you would measure the eye-to-eye length of the shock when it's static, and then when it's fully compressed, you measure it again. So you might have to take the coil off to do that, but there's a few different ways of doing this sort of thing. That's pretty much it. Next question, how can I make my fork run smoother? Well, a lower leg service will do that. It's a fairly simple process. We've got videos on that. They're going to be linked down there. Essentially, you pull off the lower legs and you replace the lubricant and give it a bit of a clean and bung them back on again. A bit more to it than that, but it's a very simple process if you're handy with an Allen key. And I do recommend, even if you don't intend on doing it, learning how to do it, because you'll understand why the fork is going to work better when it's lubricated. If you don't want to go the mechanical route, you can get yourself some fork lower leg lubricants, and if you lube the top of your air seals or the main seals on your fork, be very careful that none drips anywhere near your disc brake when you're doing this. Really easy mistake to make. Lubricate those, compress your forks a few times, and you'll see some dirt will be pulled out onto the actual stanchion tube. Clean that off, repeat a few times, and you'll find the fork feels really, really slick. Now, there isn't sort of an amount of times you can get away with doing this, because over time you're putting more lubricant in and more grit and stuff is going to get ingested into the fork, so you will need to perform a lower leg service in time. But as a quick way of making your fork feel much better, that's the way you want to go. Next question, how do I know what pressure to have in my forks? Well, this differs on how you ride, the fork you have, and how heavy you are, to be honest. But most suspension forks, I don't know if this one will, because it's quite a skinny offering. Yep, this one here has a chart on the back of it. So you'll see this on many major brand forks, and it will correlate to your body weight. So for example, if you weigh between 120 and 150 pounds, which is 54 to 68 kilograms, Fox recommends you have between 65 and 74 PSI, which is 4.5 to 5.1 bar. And they even recommend settings for your rebound damping on here. So you'll see this on RockShox forks, on Fox forks, and some other brands as well. But if you can't get the information from the fork itself, look on your manufacturer's website. So most suspension manufacturers are pretty clued up now, and they'll have a chart with guideline base settings. Now, these base settings used to be a bit of a joke because it was just total guessing, but now they're actually really accurate. And I'd say probably 8 or 9 times out of 10, you're going to get a setup that's nearly bang on for you, and you just might make some minor adjustments there. So I would start looking at the manufacturer websites first. And if you can't do that, then you need to go the old school method and measure the sag correctly. So depending on what fork you have, let's just say you're looking for 25% sag and your fork has 100 millimeters of travel. So 25% of that is 25 millimeters. So you're looking for 25 millimeters sag, which is the amount the fork moves under your body weight when you get on the bike. And then adjust your air pressure accordingly. Again, we've got videos on setting sag in the description underneath. I think we've pretty much made most videos, but a lot of them can get confused because some people are looking for very specific things. Hopefully that helps. The next one is, oh, this is good. In the push for progressivity, what riding situations make a case for a linear leverage? I would say it's probably less about intention of the riding and more about the way the designer has wanted the bike to perform. So you think on a bike, it's not just a case of, we're going to build a bike that has a progressive feeling back end. It's more a case of, hey, we want to build a bike that has no anti-squat and no anti-rise, but has chain stays of this length, that has a 4-bar linkage, and we want to mount the shock vertically, and we want to blah, 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 blah. Yeah, there's a lot of different configurations to take into account, and they will have to adhere to different styles of leverage curves and things like that when they're actually designing the bikes. Now, in a preferable world, you're looking for a linear or progressive generally, because of the fact it gives you more freedom of choice over the way you spec a shock on there. But in terms of actual riding, let's just split this in half completely. We'll talk about cross-country bikes and downhill bikes. On a downhill bike, you almost certainly would prefer to have a progressive feeling back end on the bike because of the way that you load the bike into such let's say abusive trail sections, yeah? You want the bike to retain its composure. If it's clapping through that travel all the time, that's really hard for the shock to control accordingly. So a more progressive feeling back end is going to be better when you're really pushing into stuff hard. Whereas the opposite can be said with the cross-country bike. A cross-country race bike with up to 100 millimeters of rear wheel travel doesn't have much travel, and they want to make it supple and use that travel to the best efficiency. So a more linear rear end would be better, because let's face it, cross-country racers, even on the more technical courses, they're not like pushing into hollows and jumping around and smashing the bike. They're trying to ride as efficiently as possible, and that will suit that a bit better. And final question, what does compression do versus adding PSI to your shock? Well, completely different things. Adding air pressure or adding more PSI into your shock just makes your shock firmer. Adding compression alters the way the damping works on there. Now, if you're well, let's take this into two forms of damping here. So low speed damping will be what you have on the dials on your shock. So that will be like mid and locked, for example, and that just controls the position of the shock. Whereas your high-speed damping, which isn't always externally adjustable on shocks, but when it can be, that deals with the impact of the velocity of the shock moving at high speed, and that means a big bump. So if you add too much high-speed compression damping, the shock can feel harsh or like it's choking a bit, like it can't quite absorb the shock, and some of that shock still makes its way through because the shock isn't responding in time. This can be known as spiking, like you get damping spikes. If you imagine damping feeling like nice warm lines as the bike's pattering through stuff, and every now and then you feel a jar, that will be a spike of impact. That's what you're trying to alleviate by using the suspension correctly. So yeah, just adding pressure makes it firmer and it won't work. Adding too much compression damping can make it feel harsher, but essentially the compression is there to absorb the shock before it gets to you. I think we've covered a lot of things actually. So if you've got more suspension questions, get going in the conversation underneath, and we'll see you in the next Ask. See you later.